Hello, my name is Dr. Pia Johnson, and I'm a visual artist, photographer, curator, and lecturer at RMIT University in Australia. My presentation is titled Re-Orient, Reclaiming Space Through Photographic Self-portraiture. I would like to acknowledge that I am coming from the traditional lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in the Macedon Ranges in Australia. I also want to acknowledge that the place that I was making on were the lands of the Woiwurrung in Naarm. I want to pay my respects to traditional owners past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and it was and will always be Aboriginal land. The structure of this presentation will be a contextualisation of the building, the Customs House, that is the main focus of my practice-led research project Re-Orient. Speaking to how it is placed within Naarm's foundational building as a colonial city. I'll outline details about the architecture and the building and the legacy of it. I'll then speak about my photographic images that I made in the Customs House, utilising performance-based and phenomenological methodologies situated within a feminist, activist history and contemporary transcultural landscape. Key words for this presentation are identity, colonialism, photography, self-portraiture, migration, performance, Eurasian and architecture. On a bend along the Yarra River, a white tent was erected in 1837, 5 years after the founding of Melbourne, or its traditional place name is Naarm in the Woiwurrung language, which is from one of the 5 Aboriginal clans of the Eastern Kulin Nation, who inhabited the area for around 40,000 years, and prior to colonialisation was a nation of more than 20,000 people. The tent represented the earliest form of customs house and was close to where boats unloaded stock and supplies. With maritime trade rapidly expanding in the 1840s, a larger bluestone building was constructed, and until the need for something bigger began during the 1850s, when the demand was there due to the gold rush, where there was a huge influx of people and trade. What stands there today is a 150-year-old grandiose white building called the Customs House. It was built from the revenue of the gold rush, and the Victorian colonial government commissioned Peter Kerr to design it. Kerr also was involved in the General Post Office building and the Victoria's Parliament House. The building of the Customs House began in 1855 but was not completed till 1873. With a slightly different design by Kerr and 2 other government architects, John James Clark and Arthur Ebden Johnson. The architecture was based on the Italian Renaissance palace. In the palazzo style, the ground floor is a storage area, here made of bluestone, and the main activity occurs on the piano nobile, or noble level, on the first floor. Architect Peter Kerr modelled the Ionic columns and door architraves on details of the Erechtheian temple in Athens. The plaster decorations may have been manufactured locally by British and Italian modellers, who established a local industry in the 1850s. The Customs House was built to be one of Melbourne's grand buildings. Its grandeur declared that Melbourne was a thriving and wealthy metropolis, linked by trade to Britain and the other major cities of the British Empire. Customs was the treasure house of the government income. Until the introduction of income tax in 1915, customs duties raised some 4/5 of all government revenue. Seen here in a proposal for the building to become government offices in the 1970s, the Professor Brian Lewis, Dean Faculty of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, is quoted that the Customs House is the most distinguished of the very fine group of public buildings erected by the state of Victoria. He says, "I make this statement on the grounds that the building is both purest and the most continuous in the English colonial tradition." The importance of this key white representation of colonial rule and the building to uphold those traditions was seen not only in its protectionist and protective measures as a customs house for trade, but also for immigration. Customs officers controlled immigration into Victoria. Any person regarded as undesirable could be refused entry. Immigration restrictions in Victoria began during the gold rush, when a landing tax was imposed on all Chinese arrivals. By the 1880s, Chinese immigration was barred. Restrictions soon applied to all non-Europeans. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 introduced the dictation test, which enabled anyone to be excluded on racial grounds. This became the cornerstone of the so-called White Australia policy. As you can see here from the quote from Wall Moore, if you wish to keep an immigrant out of Australia, and this could apply to anyone, you could apply the dictation test. That meant giving him a test in dictation in a language other than his own. We had to have an interpreter as well to have it explained. It was intended that no one passed. It was the ultimate weapon to keep people out of Australia. And to the right of it, a cartoon where even Father Christmas was also not welcome. In the heart of the Customs House, and where most of the official business happened, is the incredibly grand ballroom-type room, called the Long Room. The hall, as the Weekly Times stated, has noble proportions and is finished in a style which will secure unbounded admiration from all whose business leaves them free to appreciate the beautiful in art. Here in this image you can see how the long room was utilised, and as per this drawing it is worth noting it is only men, and white men, depicted, with no women or children or people of colour present. This drawing would have been used to articulate its grand scale and the appropriate use as a marker of wealthy civilization for Victoria. Here is an image of the side view of the long room today, mainly used as a function event or performance space with educational tours also happening that speak to its history. You can see me in this image with a few chairs set up for an upcoming event. What should be noted is the metrics of this space. People are so very small. The columns start at head height and they leer over you. When you walk into the room you feel small and you can not hold the whole view in one vantage point. You must look up or look out and across the space. It is so large and expansive. The long room is one of the key spaces that I utilised and created photographs in, as it is so representative of colonial power. It is a building designed by white men for white men. After being made into government offices, it was eventually turned into the Immigration Museum in the early 1990s, which it still is today. The museum speaks to and includes information and objects that provide details of its location, construction and the people and activities it housed that represent the story of Victoria's trade, immigration and government. It tells of Melbourne's achievements as well as its prejudices. The choice of this building for my exploration came through a desire to understand how colonial buildings still resonate in contemporary society. While the Immigration Museum lends itself to many migrant groups as a place of gathering, celebrating immigration, and the chance of being the focal point of the vast multicultural nation that Australia and NAM is, I wanted to explore this through my own artistic practice, to come to terms with this history and a space where my ancestors would not have been welcome or tolerated. Through a residency model, across 1 year, I was able to spend within the spaces of the Customs House, supported by Immigration Museum and funding through Creative Victoria. I read all the museum displays, researched the intricacies of the building and its design, its uses and place within the history of NAM. I was able to just spend time within the various levels of the building, walk the corridors that people did not use, sit along the stairwell and watch the people who visited, children who came for school trips and staff that moved through providing tours and information. It was through this time that I phenomenologically read the building, its site specificity, trying to consider history as real and imagined and take in the experiential feelings of being situated in this space. The use of self-portrait photography is a specific and particular performative action in photography. For me, to use self-portraiture as a device, this enables a self-reflexive action, a turning the camera onto oneself, but also for the transcultural woman, an act of safety and defiance. I am both photographer and subject muse, and it is the perfect mode for exploring agency within the visual form. As a Eurasian Australian, I perform my cultural identity. The signifying practices of my identity are inherited in both cultural and physical ways that influence and reveal themselves through a range of activities, gestures, costume, and knowledge that make up my Eurasian Australian identity. I use performance as a visual, explorative mode to investigate ideas of agency, cultural in-betweenness, and fluidity. The body is engaged with negotiations of orientation, space, and place. The significance of using my own body and my own face is that it represents and presents the physical features of my own Eurasian Australian experience. The photographs created through the residency aim to conjure a sense of play, of resistance and disruption to the building and its architecture. Drawing on the feminist photographic practices of Claude Cahun, Valley exporter Carrie Mae Weems, the photograph's use of performance and J.L. Austin's notion of performative utterances to assert myself within the architecture and to fix this within the photograph. The use of performance method and situating it within the site-specific location of the customs house enabled me to speak to the structures acutely. As Gay Macaulay states, making performances in site-specific places marked by their own histories of occupation and use means that artists and spectators experience these places in new ways with the political issues that seem to be an inevitable consequence of being in place. While my performances are not durational, nor are they witnessed by an audience, my photographs go one step further in embedding the temporal into a fixed and recorded moment that would otherwise not exist. This is supported by academic Joshua Chambers-Letson, who states that performance is a fecund site for minoritarian objects to engage in the act of sociogeny, by using performance to make and remake the self and others within a threatening and unsteady landscape that is overwhelmingly constrained by the limits of the here and now. Or, as academic Letizia Modena describes Rina Bianchi's and Carrie Mae Weems' photographs taken in Rome, as counter-narratives that seek to invert the architectonic and monumental erasure of minority identities throughout history. My work sits within this same vein of reclaiming my identity within the spaces. Inserting myself as a subject within the space provides a physicality that is performed in the photographs. I climb, scale, move through and interrogate the spaces and architecture. My aim is to upend the histories and known memories within the building, to use the body to inhabit space that women of colour were not visible in, and demonstrate that multi-generational presence of women of colour and transcultural histories about their place in contemporary Australia. As part of this transformation of the building, I am looking to shift the perspectives displayed also. How can we find new ways of seeing, of being in this building within these metrics? Here the photographs start to find a new language of seeing the building, of claiming the spaces. Whether climbing onto the bench seat and making myself higher, or lying on the floor, I move within the frame. I shift the way you see and I see within it. A way of reorienting the body once again. I shift the body, I shift my feelings, I also shift the way we engage with the mode of histories, aiming to reframe them and allowing us to think about building them differently. Indeed, there are quieter moments reflected in the series also, articulating a sense of liminality, defeat, overwhelm, or loss. These images speak to the unimaginable disappointment of not being accepted in, or journeying weeks or months across seas and lands to only be turned back. Or perhaps the feelings of separation and anxiety as family members were interviewed to see what fate was ahead of them. Here the gesture of the body, its corporeality within the building, is reflected and witnessed. There is no comfort here. We are left with a melancholy and awareness of the dark times that provide a consciousness of only what has happened and still happens across the globe today. Costume is also an important component in the artwork. It is, as academics Sanya Potavaki and Peter McNeill state, an active agent for performance making. It is a material object that embodies ideas shaped through collaborative creative work. The costume design by my collaborator, designer Kat Chan, is an adaptive and fluid garment that aimed to represent a blend of my own cultural background, Chinese and Italian heritage, and draws inspiration from the Han Dynasty long sleeve robe, Italian lush jacquard, brocade, and velvet textures, but also the contemporary bomber jacket and global street shoe. Not only a practical design where I could take off layers and sections, embodying and transforming it into different modes, meaning and times, its gold also provides a link back to the gold rush, a critical time for Chinese and Italian migration to Australia, as well as the shared symbol of prosperity and luck associated with it. The second part of my residency was to look at the archive and the collection held within the museum, drawing out further narratives of migrant histories and stories linked to Melbourne from a range of different countries and times. Bringing together a range of different stories, objects and photographs, the research in the collection made me consider how the building, Australia's immigration policies, both historical and current, have affected so many people's lives and journeys over time. The collection is filled with individual moments of lives now gone, and so I decided to include them to speak to how the colonial legacies have played out over time. This image is described by Museums Victoria senior curator Moya McFadden, who worked with me on the project very closely. And this image is seen, and this writing, on the exhibition wall as Wing Young, Jeff, and Ling Po, Phyllis Gung giggle with glee. Behind them, another grand piece of Melbourne architecture, the Royal Exhibition Building in Carlton. Their grandparents were Sydney Gung, who migrated from China around 1900, and Yun Ping He Yu, born in Celestial Lane, Melbourne, in 1890. This photo was taken in 1947, soon after Jeff and Phyllis, born in China, came to Australia with their mother and Australian-born father. The Customs House would not have welcomed Sydney and Yun Ping, but their grandchildren seemed to be laughing at its solemnity, delightfully ignorant of the prevailing white Australia policy at the time. In addition, I wanted to reveal feminist narratives alongside transcultural ones, the ones that revealed everyday moments of change, of purpose and of becoming within the collection. Here on the left is the original digitised version of a picture of Lily Segalis. It's described, Lily Segalis, who arrived in Australia from Greece in 1922 at the age of 18 to marry her cousin, stands a few years later in her first pair of trousers in a classic Australian bush environment. She is strong, confident, in control. She has found her place, her sense of self. Also written by Moya McFadden. Merging her into the wall of the Customs House, I sense she is not scared by the building, its policies, or life as a migrant. She is made large, and I watch quietly, looking up at her, visible now on the wall. Incorporating my own family's histories was important too, placing my own skin, relatives, ancestry into the collection and onto the building's structures. While photographs were natural draw cards, I also utilised certified documents which enabled me to investigate and understand the various layers of migration in Australia and their materiality. Here, language and translation were critical, and identification data a huge part of the migration process. The use of archival imagery into the photographs creates a sense of magic and a larger-than-life presence. I am drawn to their talismanic properties, their ability to cross past and present time, where the nature of the archive as a place which memory is organised and legitimised is also made explicit, in which images can open up to another temporal horizon. In these images, where I include the archival ones, the figure, myself, becomes faceless, an observer to the historical story, a witness and caring holder of the precious generations before me. A nod to the many people before us that have moved through the building, the harsh migration policies, and the act of being migrants. The final exhibition was curated and placing the photographs back into the community gallery of the Immigration Museum, Customs House. The images come together to envelop you in the space, to move the viewer in and out and articulate the space they have just walked through anew. The artworks make the viewer think again, question and see the spaces with a different set of parameters, stories and voices, to reconsider histories, their own and those around them perhaps, and the responsibility of understanding migrations more fervently. The photographs are a collective presentation of myself, coming to terms with my transcultural identity and making space for people like myself within the legacy of colonialism. The photographs reframe the building's dark history and imagine it as a space we might all belong in. The self-portraits are a continuous state of meditation and becoming within the architecture. They picture me as a way of seeing, of self-awareness, but most importantly, in the ongoing process of imaging oneself into the world.